She walked in, catching him with another woman. But instead of crying or screaming, she simply smiled and walked away. Confused, the millionaire thought he had won, until he realized she had a plan and left him with nothing. And that was just the beginning. Evelyn Carter had always been the kind of woman who knew how to wait. She had spent years perfecting the art of patience, mastering the ability to sit in silence, to smile at all the right moments, to give just enough of herself to make people believe she was exactly what they wanted her to be. She understood power, not the loud, showy kind that men like Daniel Whitmore wielded, but the quiet, subtle strength that came from knowing when to act and when to hold back. Tonight, as she stepped through the front door of their penthouse, she was finally done waiting. The air inside was different. It wasn't anything obvious. No misplaced objects, no hurried shuffling of feet, but there was something, an unspoken shift, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface. The penthouse was too quiet, unnaturally so. Evelyn paused in the entryway, tilting her head slightly, listening. Then she heard it. A soft, distant laugh. Feminine. Muffled voices, the rustling of sheets, and the unmistakable sound of a hushed whisper that carried down the hallway like an electric current through the air. She inhaled slowly, controlled, feeling her pulse steady. It wasn't anger that filled her. It was something else entirely, something calmer, colder. She had known. Of course, she had known. The late-night meetings that stretched into early mornings, the way his phone was suddenly always face down, the faint scent of a floral perfume that didn't belong to her lingering on his suits. The signs had been there for months, small at first, then undeniable. But knowledge was one thing, proof was another. And now, as she stood at the foot of the grand staircase leading up to their bedroom, she finally had both. She could have turned around and walked away, could have spared herself the sight of whatever scene was unfolding behind that door, but there was no satisfaction in that. No, Evelyn wanted to see it, to step into that room, to let them feel the weight of their own guilt as they looked at her. She wanted them to know that she knew. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand grazing the polished wooden railing, her steps unhurried. She wasn't rushing, wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had caught her off guard. Let them scramble. Let them panic. By the time she reached the top, the whispers had stopped. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that came just before a storm. Evelyn didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She simply pushed the door open. And there they were. Daniel was standing near the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, his belt unfastened, his hair slightly disheveled. The woman, brunette, young, beautiful in a forgettable sort of way, was tangled in the silk sheets, her body halfway turned toward him as if she had been reaching for him just moments before. They both froze as the door swung open, their eyes locking onto Evelyn like deer caught in headlights. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Evelyn could hear the distant hum of traffic from the city below, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the nightstand. Daniel was the first to react, straightening slightly, clearing his throat as if preparing to speak, but she didn't give him the chance. She smiled. It was small, barely there, but unmistakable. A slow, knowing curve of her lips, deliberate and controlled. It wasn't forced, wasn't exaggerated. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down a person's spine, the kind that didn't belong in a moment like this. Daniel's expression flickered, confusion crossing his features before something else settled in, unease. He had expected anger, tears, accusations. He had braced himself for screaming, for the inevitable fight, for the messiness of betrayal laid bare. But Evelyn didn't give him any of that. She just stood there, composed, looking at him the way a queen might look at a jester who had outlived his usefulness. The woman in the bed shifted uncomfortably, pulling the sheets higher over her chest, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Daniel. It was almost amusing, really, how she thought she was part of this moment. She wasn't. She was just another piece in a story that had already been written, a minor character in a narrative that had nothing to do with her. Evelyn turned, walking away without a word. Eve. Daniel finally found his voice, taking a step toward her. Wait. She didn't stop. He followed her, his footsteps quick against the floor, his tone shifting from uncertain to commanding. We need to talk about this. Evelyn reached the stairs, moving down them at the same measured pace she had climbed them. She could hear him behind her, his breathing slightly heavier now, like a man who realized he had miscalculated his position in the game. At the front door, he reached for her arm, but she slipped away effortlessly, turning just enough to meet his gaze. There was something desperate in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "I hope you two had fun," she said, her voice light, almost amused. And then she stepped outside. The night air was crisp, cool against her skin as she walked down the quiet street. The city stretched out before her, glowing and alive, a stark contrast to the hollow shell of a marriage she had just left behind. She didn't look back. There was no need. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. A new message had come in, exactly the one she had been waiting for. "It's done. The last transfer went through. He has nothing." She read it twice, letting the words settle, feeling the full weight of what they meant. And then, for the first time in a long time, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over. She tapped out a quick reply. "Perfect. Serve the papers tomorrow. Make sure it's public." The reply came almost instantly. "Consider it done." She slipped her phone back into her bag, stepping off the curb and into the waiting car. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but she didn't acknowledge him. She was already lost in thought, already moving forward. She had spent years playing her part, waiting, planning, preparing. But patience had its limits. And tonight, Evelyn Carter was finally done waiting. What would you do if you caught your partner cheating? Would you leave quietly or make them regret it? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible tales of karma and redemption. Evelyn Carter didn't rush. There was no need to. Everything was already in motion, every step of her plan unfolding with meticulous precision. She had spent months preparing for this moment, long before she ever walked into that bedroom and saw Daniel's pathetic attempt at secrecy unravel before her eyes. That had been the final confirmation, but not the catalyst. No, the decision had been made long before that. She had simply been waiting for the perfect moment to walk away. As the car moved through the streets of Manhattan, Evelyn leaned back against the leather seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone. The city lights flickered past in a blur of neon and steel, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing she had orchestrated something flawlessly, that she had controlled every variable, accounted for every possible reaction. Daniel had thought he was the one holding all the cards. He had no idea the game had been played long before he even realized there was one. She pulled up an email on her phone, scanning through the final documents once more. Everything was where it needed to be. The assets were transferred, the accounts were emptied, and the lawyers had already prepared the divorce filing. There would be no messy back and forth, no drawn-out legal battle. Evelyn had ensured that by making sure Daniel had nothing left to fight for. The car slowed as they reached the private building where she had been quietly setting up her new life. A residence under a separate name, one Daniel had no knowledge of. She had made sure of that, tying every legal connection back to an alias, ensuring that when she walked away, she would do so without leaving a single trace behind. As she stepped inside, the concierge greeted her with a polite nod, already aware of her arrival. This wasn't a hotel, wasn't some temporary escape. This was hers. The apartment was minimalist, sleek, and nothing like the grand excess of the penthouse she had shared with Daniel. It was designed for one purpose, to be a place where she could rebuild, reinvent, and most importantly, remain untouchable. She set her bag down on the glass table in the center of the living room, her gaze drifting over the space. The silence was different here. It wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet of a house filled with lies and unspoken betrayals. It was clean, sharp, unburdened. She poured herself a drink, letting the smooth liquid burn against her throat, savoring the moment. Daniel would be panicking by now. She could picture it vividly, the frantic checking of accounts, the realization that something was missing, the phone calls, the growing frustration, the sinking horror when he finally grasped what had happened. It wouldn't take him long to realize that the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had assumed would crumble at the first sign of betrayal, had left him with absolutely nothing. She didn't expect him to give up easily. Daniel was the kind of man who believed he was untouchable, who had spent years operating under the delusion that money could fix anything. But money wasn't the issue here. Power was. And Evelyn had stripped him of his in one clean, calculated move. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her attorney. Confirmed. Divorce papers will be delivered at his board meeting tomorrow morning. Press will be notified an hour later. She smirked, setting the phone down. Perfect. It was a cruel move, yes. But Daniel had spent years teaching her that business and cruelty often went hand in hand. If he was going to be humiliated, it would be on the largest stage possible, in front of the people he valued most, the ones who would see his downfall as weakness, as failure. And failure was something Daniel Whitmore could not afford. She had learned that early in their marriage, when she was still naive enough to believe that love had anything to do with survival. She had seen how he maneuvered, how he built his empire not on loyalty or ethics, but on leverage. He didn't form relationships, he acquired them. He didn't cherish people, he used them. And for a time, she had been one of his most valuable assets. Until she wasn't. Until he thought he could replace her with someone younger, more pliable, someone who would stroke his ego instead of challenge it. Evelyn had no interest in begging for scraps of affection, in holding on to something that had long since rotted beneath the surface. But she wasn't going to leave quietly, either. That wasn't who she was. The next morning, she woke early, moving through her new apartment with the ease of someone who had already detached herself from her former life. She dressed carefully, choosing a sleek, dark ensemble, elegant, powerful, understated. She wasn't dressing for Daniel. She was dressing for herself. For the woman she had always been beneath the layers of expectation and performance. By the time Daniel's name appeared on her phone, she had already anticipated the call. She let it ring twice before answering, her tone smooth, controlled. "What's wrong, darling?" His voice was a sharp contrast, anger laced with disbelief. "What the hell have you done?" Evelyn took a sip of her coffee, unbothered. "I'm assuming you're referring to the divorce papers? You think you can just take everything? You think this is over?" He was unraveling already, his carefully curated composure cracking at the edges. She smiled, the same way she had the night before, when she had stood in that doorway and watched his world collapse. "Oh, Daniel," she said softly, almost sympathetically. "It was over long before last night. You just weren't paying attention." He cursed under his breath, and she imagined him pacing his office, his hands raking through his hair, his mind spinning through options, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. Not this time. "You won't get away with this," he warned, his voice low, dangerous. Evelyn sighed, as if the conversation bored her. "I already have." She ended the call before he could respond, setting the phone aside. She had no doubt that he would try something. He would grasp at whatever straws were left, looking for a way to regain control. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. She had made sure of that. A second later, her phone buzzed again. Another update from her attorney. "The accounts are secure. His attempts to access them have been blocked. He's calling his legal team now, but they won't be able to undo anything. Everything was finalized before he even knew it was happening." She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This was what freedom felt like. Not just the act of leaving, but the certainty that there was no going back, that the past was nothing more than a ghost in the rearview mirror. She picked up her cup again, taking another sip, watching as the city stretched out beyond the windows. The empire Daniel had built was crumbling, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn Carter was finally free. Daniel Whitmore had built his empire on the illusion of control. It was what had propelled him forward, what had made him into the man he was. A man who could walk into any room and command attention. A man whose handshake could close million-dollar deals before a contract was even drawn. Control was his currency, his weapon, his armor. And yet, as he sat in the back of his sleek black town car that morning, his phone gripped so tightly in his hand that his knuckles turned white, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something worse. It was fear. His morning had begun like any other. A meeting at the firm, followed by a round of calls to investors, the usual routine that kept his world running like a well-oiled machine. But the moment he stepped into his office and opened his laptop, his entire world tilted. The numbers didn't make sense. His accounts, his personal ones, his business investments, the offshore holdings he had thought were untouchable, were all empty. The realization struck him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily stunned, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. He refreshed the page, convinced it was some kind of glitch. But it wasn't. A second later, his phone buzzed with a call from his financial advisor, and the second he heard the man's voice, shaky, uncertain, afraid, Daniel knew something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. "We can't access any of your liquid assets," the man stammered, as if afraid to even speak the words. "Every account under your name was drained, transferred through a network of trusts and holding companies, completely legal, from what we can see. But it's gone, sir. Everything." Daniel's breath came short, his pulse thundering against his temple. "That's not possible." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that only made things worse. "Sir, your wife had access." The words barely registered before another call came through, his attorney. Daniel barely had time to register the gut punch of realization before answering. "Tell me you can fix this." His attorney hesitated, a hesitation that made Daniel's stomach drop. "She planned this," the man finally said, his voice tight. "Months in advance. She didn't just take the money. She transferred ownership of key assets, shares, real estate holdings. She did it quietly, methodically. We can challenge some of it in court, but, Daniel, she's left you with nothing liquid. She even transferred control of." The line cut out as Daniel's driver pulled up to the firm's headquarters. His body moved on autopilot, stepping out of the car, striding into the building as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. He could feel it, a noose tightening around his throat with each step. His assistant greeted him with a nervous expression, shifting uncomfortably behind her desk. "Sir, there's something you should." Before she could finish, the doors to the boardroom swung open, and all eyes turned toward him. They were already waiting for him. He could tell by their faces that they knew. Some looked smug, others wary, but most just looked eager to watch the great Daniel Whitmore fall. At the head of the table, his chief financial officer slid a thick stack of papers across the table. "Your wife filed for divorce," the man said bluntly, his tone clipped. "And she made sure everyone knew about it before you did." Daniel barely looked at the documents before turning toward the flat screen mounted on the far wall, where a live financial report was playing. The headline at the bottom of the screen hit him like a truck. "Evelyn Carter Whitmore files for divorce, moves to secure majority assets in Whitmore Holdings." Daniel's vision blurred for half a second, rage and disbelief colliding in his chest. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would cry, that she would beg for some kind of last-ditch reconciliation, that she would play the role of the devastated wife desperate to hold on to what was left of their marriage. But she hadn't. She had gone for the throat. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw locking so tightly that he could feel the pressure in his teeth. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. Evelyn had publicly humiliated him, had reduced him to a cautionary tale for every investor, every competitor, every so-called friend who had been waiting for the right moment to question his authority. "Cancel all my meetings," he muttered, already storming toward the exit. His assistant scrambled behind him, trying to keep up. "Sir, your wife." "She's not my wife," he snapped, the words coming out harsher than intended. But he wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't thinking at all. He was moving on instinct, on rage, on the sheer need to claw back the control that had been ripped from his hands. By the time he reached his penthouse, his pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. The place was eerily quiet, too still, as if Evelyn had taken more than just money when she walked out. She had taken the air, the warmth, the illusion of home. He moved through the space quickly, going straight to the office where he kept his private financial records. He reached for the safe, punched in the code, and nothing. Invalid. His hands clenched, trembling with the force of his fury. He tried again. Invalid. His breathing turned sharp, ragged. He punched the code in a third time, his heart hammering against his ribs. Invalid. A slow, creeping realization settled into his bones. She had locked him out of his own life. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Daniel Whitmore had lost. And he had no idea how to fix it. His phone rang again, his attorney's name flashing across the screen, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned toward the bar cart in the corner of the room, pouring himself a drink with a hand that wasn't quite steady. As he lifted the glass to his lips, his gaze landed on a single piece of paper resting on the desk. A note. Neat, elegant handwriting. No emotion. No explanation. Just a few simple words. You had everything. Now, you have exactly what you deserve. Daniel's grip tightened around the glass, his pulse roaring in his ears. Evelyn hadn't just left. She had burned the entire empire down on her way out. And the worst part? She had done it with a smile. Sophie Reynolds had always known what she wanted. She had spent her entire life watching men like Daniel Whitmore climb to the top, controlling everything and everyone in their path, taking whatever they pleased without a second thought. She had spent years learning how to position herself in the right places, speaking in the right tones, dressing in the kind of effortless elegance that whispered wealth and exclusivity. She knew how to make men notice her. More importantly, she knew how to make them believe they were the ones in control. That was the thing about men like Daniel. They never suspected they were being played. For a while, it had worked perfectly. Daniel had been everything she expected. Charming, powerful, reckless in all the ways that made him exciting. She had been drawn to his confidence, the way he walked into a room like he owned the world, the way people scrambled to please him. And, of course, there was the money. The luxury, the trips, the endless gifts that appeared at her doorstep without her having to ask. It was thrilling, intoxicating, everything she had imagined it would be. Until it wasn't. Until the money stopped. Until the power shifted. Until she woke up in Daniel's penthouse and realized that the man who had once seemed untouchable was now drowning in the very world he had built for himself. It started with the phone calls. At first, Daniel ignored them, brushing them off with a wave of his hand, claiming it was nothing more than business dealings gone wrong, a temporary inconvenience. But Sophie wasn't stupid. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped his phone too tightly, the way his jaw clenched when he read his emails. He was losing control, and for the first time since she had met him, he didn't know how to fix it. Then came the meetings. Or, rather, the canceled ones. Daniel had always been busy, but now he was scrambling. One minute, he was on the phone with his lawyers, demanding answers. The next, he was calling investors, trying to smooth over what Evelyn had done. But it was clear, things were slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp them. Sophie had never cared much about Evelyn. She had assumed she was just another rich wife, the kind who turned a blind eye as long as the money kept flowing, as long as the diamonds and the couture dresses were enough to buy her silence. But she had been wrong. Evelyn hadn't been a fool. She had been a strategist. And now, as Sophie stood in the middle of the penthouse, watching Daniel pour himself another drink at 11 in the morning, she felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake. She had left everything for this, had walked away from her previous life, convinced that this was the upgrade she deserved. She had imagined herself as the future Mrs. Whitmore, draped in diamonds, attending exclusive galas, sipping champagne on yachts. But now, she was watching Daniel unravel before her eyes, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be around when he finally collapsed completely. "Daniel," she said carefully, stepping toward him. "Maybe you should take a break. Clear your head." He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "A break? You think I can afford a break right now?" Sophie crossed her arms, forcing herself to stay calm. "I think you're spiraling, and it's not helping." He turned to face her, his eyes bloodshot, exhaustion and frustration clouding his usual arrogance. "You don't understand what she's done," he said, voice tight with barely restrained anger. "She didn't just take the money. She made sure I can't recover. The media's eating it up. Investors are pulling out. My own board is questioning my leadership." Sophie said nothing. What was there to say? She wasn't used to seeing Daniel like this. He had always been so sure of himself, always in control, always the man with a plan. But now, he looked like a man who had been blindsided, who had underestimated the wrong person. He was unraveling, and she was beginning to wonder how much of that unraveling she wanted to be a part of. The reality of her situation was sinking in fast. Daniel wasn't the man she had fallen for, not anymore. He wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure she had admired from a distance. He was just another man who had been outplayed, left standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. And she was standing in those ruins with him. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Daniel barely spoke to her, too consumed by his attempts to salvage what was left of his empire. He was making calls at all hours, snapping at his assistant, ignoring her presence entirely. He stopped taking her out, stopped buying her things, stopped making any effort at all. It was as if, in losing his fortune, he had also lost the ability to care about anything else, including her. And then, the final blow. One night, after hours of watching him pace around the penthouse, muttering to himself, she decided she had had enough. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharper than before. "I need to know what's happening. What does this mean for us?" He didn't even look at her. "Daniel." Still nothing. She stepped in front of him, forcing him to stop. "You can't just shut me out," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "We're in this together." That was when he finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. There was no affection there, no warmth, just exhaustion, frustration, and something dangerously close to resentment. "In this together," he repeated, his voice hollow. Then he let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Sophie, you were never in this. You were just here for the good parts. And now that things are bad, you're looking for reassurance." He shook his head, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You made a bet, sweetheart. And you lost." The words hit her like ice water, the truth cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She had thought she was different, thought she had mattered. But she didn't. She had never mattered. She had been a distraction, a passing amusement. And now that Daniel had nothing left to offer, neither did she. She stared at him, swallowing the lump in her throat. "So that's it." Daniel didn't respond. He had already turned away, already moving on to his next problem, as if she wasn't standing there, as if she wasn't breaking apart right in front of him. That was when she knew. She had to leave. She had been chasing a dream that didn't exist, had thrown everything away for a man who would never do the same for her. And if she stayed, she would sink with him. So she packed her bags that night. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't say a word as she walked out of the penthouse and into the elevator. She had played the game, and she had lost. And somewhere, she knew, Evelyn Carter was smiling. Evelyn Carter sat in her new apartment, a glass of wine in hand, watching the city stretch out before her. The skyline, illuminated in a sea of lights, felt like an entirely different world from the one she had just walked away from. It had taken years to reach this moment, years of patience, quiet observation, and careful planning. Now, as she sat in the space she had secured for herself, completely removed from the suffocating presence of Daniel Whitmore, she felt something unfamiliar but intoxicating settle in her chest. Freedom. Not just the act of leaving, but the knowledge that she had done so on her own terms. Her phone vibrated on the table beside her. She reached for it, already knowing who it would be. "It's done," the voice on the other end said, direct and to the point. Evelyn leaned back against the sofa, taking another slow sip of her wine. "How bad is it?" "Bad," came the amused reply. "He's in full panic mode. The board is already discussing options, and investors are pulling out by the hour. You didn't just take his money, Evelyn. You took his power. And he knows it." She smiled at that, not out of cruelty, but out of satisfaction. "Good. Let them rip him apart." There was a pause on the line, followed by a chuckle. "I have to say, I didn't think you had it in you. Not like this." Evelyn turned her gaze back toward the skyline, letting the weight of it all sink in. "Neither did he," she said simply. The call ended, and she set her phone down, exhaling slowly. The game was far from over, but the first stage was complete. Daniel had spent years believing he was the smartest man in the room, that he could manipulate and maneuver people however he pleased. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. She had been watching. For years, she had been the quiet force beside him, the one who handled the small details he never bothered with. She had sat in the background while he talked deals over expensive dinners, while he built his empire on charm and well-timed intimidation. He had never imagined that the woman sitting next to him was taking notes, studying his every move, preparing for the day she would need to use those same tactics against him. And now here they were. The reports were already circulating, news of the divorce spreading through social media, finance blogs, and business networks like wildfire. Daniel Whitmore wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing his reputation. The very foundation of his power was built on perception, on the image of an untouchable, dominant force in the industry. Evelyn had ensured that perception crumbled in front of the people who mattered most. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. "Daniel is trying to reach you. Multiple times. He's not handling this well." She rolled her eyes. Of course, he wasn't. She knew him too well, knew exactly how he would react when the realization hit. The anger, the denial, the desperate attempts to reverse the damage. He would go through every stage, convincing himself that there was still a way to turn things in his favor. But there wasn't. Not this time. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She set down her glass, smoothing her dress as she stood. She had been expecting this visit. When she opened the door, the man standing on the other side greeted her with a polite nod. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit, carrying a folder that held the final pieces of her new beginning. "Ms. Carter," he said, "everything has been finalized. The assets have been transferred, and the business restructuring is in motion. As of this morning, you have full controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings." Evelyn took the folder from his hands, flipping through the documents with a practiced eye. She had spent months preparing for this moment, working with the right people to ensure every detail was executed flawlessly. Daniel had assumed she would take a payout and disappear, that she would leave with enough to keep her comfortable, but never enough to threaten him. He had underestimated her. "Thank you," she said smoothly, signing the final document with ease. "And the media? They're having a field day. The narrative is already shifting in your favor. A wronged wife turning the tables on a cheating billionaire? They love it. You're being painted as a brilliant strategist who played the long game and won." Evelyn chuckled, handing the signed documents back. "Perfect." The man gave her a knowing look. "You planned every step of this, didn't you?" She met his gaze evenly. "Of course I did." As he left, she closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. It was surreal, in a way. The last few months had been an endless series of careful moves, sleepless nights, and meticulous planning. Now it was over. Or at least, the part where she had to fight for control. Now she had it. She moved back toward the sofa, her eyes drifting toward the television as a news anchor discussed the latest developments. The headline scrolling across the screen read, "Billionaire Daniel Whitmore faces devastating loss as ex-wife gains majority control." She smirked. Let him feel what it was like to be powerless. Let him sit in that penthouse, watching his empire slip through his fingers the way he had once watched her disappear into the background of his life. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel Whitmore is calling. She let it ring. Then, finally, she picked up. There was a heavy silence on the other end before his voice came through, low and sharp. "Evelyn." She swirled the wine in her glass, unimpressed. "Daniel, you think this is over?" His voice was strained, filled with the kind of anger that came from a man who wasn't used to losing. She tilted her head slightly, amused. "No, Daniel. I think this is just the beginning." He exhaled sharply, frustration clear. "You have no idea what you're doing." She smiled, her voice calm. "That's where you're wrong. I know exactly what I'm doing. You just never bothered to pay attention." Silence. For the first time, Daniel had nothing to say. She could practically hear his mind racing, searching for a way to turn things around, to regain the upper hand. But there wasn't one. She had already closed every door, locked every escape route. "You won't win," he finally said. But there was less conviction in his voice now, just an empty threat from a man who was already defeated. Evelyn took another sip of her wine, letting the silence stretch. "Daniel," she said, her voice smooth, almost affectionate. "I already have." She ended the call. And for the first time in years, she felt truly, undeniably free. Daniel Whitmore had spent his entire life believing that power was permanent, that money, influence, and the sheer force of will could keep a man at the top, untouchable, immune to the petty games of those beneath him. But as he sat in the back of his car, staring at the email his lawyers had just sent, he felt something crack deep inside his chest. The words on the screen blurred slightly as his grip tightened around his phone. He scanned the documents again, hoping he had misread them, that somehow his team had overlooked a clause, a loophole, anything that could undo the damage Evelyn had inflicted. But there was nothing. Every attempt to reclaim his assets, to block the transfers, had been shot down. Every legal avenue he had pursued had led to the same dead end. She had taken everything. He leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling slowly. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, sensing the tension but knowing better than to ask questions. The city lights flickered past, each street a blur of neon and steel, but Daniel barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by one thing. Evelyn. She had done this. She had outmaneuvered him. And now, for the first time in his life, he was on the losing side of the game. The car pulled up in front of the private club where he had arranged to meet her. It was neutral ground, a place where no one would overhear their conversation, where he could speak without the weight of boardroom politics or prying eyes. He had requested the meeting, demanded it, really. He needed answers. Needed to see her face when she explained how she had managed to dismantle everything he had built. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his suit with hands that were steadier than he felt. The doorman greeted him with a nod, ushering him inside, past the lavish interior where men like him sat in dark leather chairs, sipping expensive scotch and discussing fortunes that had been made and lost. Evelyn was already waiting for him. She sat at a corner table, calm, poised, a glass of red wine in her hand. She looked entirely unaffected by the storm she had created, her expression unreadable as she watched him approach. He slid into the seat across from her, not bothering with pleasantries. "You planned this," he said, his voice low, controlled. Evelyn swirled her wine, taking a slow sip before setting the glass down with deliberate precision. "Of course I did," she said simply. His jaw tightened. He had expected denial, some attempt to justify her actions, but instead, she was giving him nothing. "You've destroyed everything," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you understand that? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Evelyn tilted her head, considering him. "I think the better question, Daniel, is do you?" He clenched his fists beneath the table. "You had no right," she laughed, a soft, amused sound that made his blood boil. "No right," she repeated. "That's rich, coming from you. Tell me, Daniel, did you ever stop to think that maybe I was paying attention all those years? That I was watching, learning, preparing for the day I'd need to walk away? Or did you assume I'd always be the quiet, obedient wife, content to exist in the shadows of your empire?" He said nothing, because the truth was, he had assumed that. Evelyn leaned forward now, mirroring his posture, her voice lowering just enough to make him listen. "You thought you could cheat, lie, manipulate, and walk away without consequences. But that's not how the world works, Daniel. Actions have consequences. And you? You've spent years writing checks your arrogance couldn't cash." His grip on the table tightened. "So this was about revenge?" She sighed, shaking her head slightly. "No, Daniel. This was about me. About reclaiming my life. You were just collateral damage." He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "So what now?" Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Now, you figure out how to live without me. Without my silence. Without my patience. Without the comfort of knowing I'd always be there, smoothing over the messes you made. You're on your own now, Daniel. And from what I've seen, you don't do well on your own." The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent so long believing he didn't need her, that she was an accessory to his life rather than a force of her own. But sitting across from her now, seeing the certainty in her eyes, he realized the truth. She had been his foundation, the thing that had kept him standing. And now, without her, he was crumbling. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he forced himself to meet her gaze. Was any of it real? For the first time, something flickered in her expression. A brief, fleeting shadow of something almost like regret. "Yes," she said quietly. "Once." He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "And now?" Evelyn exhaled slowly, standing, gathering her coat in one smooth motion. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable once more. "Now, Daniel, I don't think about you at all." She turned and walked away. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore had no idea what to do next. Sophie Reynolds had never been one to admit defeat easily. She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of reinvention, of slipping out of bad situations before they could consume her, of knowing exactly when to leave a sinking ship before it dragged her down with it. She had thought she had done that with Daniel Whitmore, thought she had secured herself a future paved with luxury and power, thought she had played her cards right. But as she sat in the tiny apartment she had rented in a part of town she hadn't stepped foot in for years, she realized just how spectacularly wrong she had been. The penthouse was gone. The designer clothes, the chauffeured cars, the exclusive restaurants where reservations were impossible unless your name carried weight. All of it had vanished overnight, slipping through her fingers the same way Daniel's fortune had. And the worst part? She hadn't even seen it coming. She should have. She should have known the moment Evelyn Carter walked out of that penthouse without shedding a single tear. She should have recognized the look in her eyes. Not devastation, not heartbreak, but something far more dangerous. Calculation. Evelyn hadn't been a woman scorned. She had been a woman executing a plan, A woman who had already won the game before Sophie even realized she had been a pawn in it. And now, Sophie was left with nothing. She glanced around the small, sterile apartment, the kind of place she had sworn she would never return to. The furniture was cheap, the walls too white, the sound of the city outside too loud, too real. There was no luxury here, no illusion of power, no security. Just a reminder of what she had lost. Or, more accurately, what she had never really had. She had been stupid. She had believed Daniel when he told her Evelyn was just a formality, that their marriage was little more than a business arrangement. She had believed him when he said he was in control, that he would take care of everything, that she would never have to worry about a thing. She had believed him right up until the moment the money stopped flowing, until the calls from his lawyers started, until she saw firsthand what a man looked like when the world he had built came crashing down around him. Daniel had stopped being charming the second he realized he was losing. He had stopped being the man who took her to five-star resorts, who draped diamonds around her neck, who whispered promises of a future built on endless luxury. He had become bitter, angry, resentful, as if she were the one responsible for his downfall, as if she had failed him, instead of the other way around. The night she left, he hadn't even tried to stop her. She had packed her things in silence, stuffing designer dresses into a suitcase that suddenly felt absurd, like a relic from another life. She had expected him to fight, to plead, to promise her that things would turn around. But he hadn't. He had barely looked at her, too consumed by his own misery to care. "Are you really just going to walk away?" she had asked, standing in the doorway, gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly her fingers ached. Daniel had let out a short, humorless laugh, not even bothering to glance up from the drink in his hand. "I don't have anything left to give you, Sophie. We both know that's why you're leaving." She had wanted to argue, to tell him that wasn't true, that she had cared about him, that she had believed in him. But the words had caught in her throat because deep down, she knew they would have been a lie. She had been in love with the version of Daniel who had power, not the man who had been stripped of it. So she had left, walking out of the penthouse with nothing but a suitcase full of expensive clothes that suddenly meant nothing. And now, sitting alone in an apartment that felt suffocating in its smallness, she realized she had no idea what came next. She wasn't like Evelyn. She didn't have an escape plan carefully mapped out, didn't have years of knowledge and quiet preparation to fall back on. She had been betting on Daniel, on the belief that he would always land on his feet, that no matter what happened, he would find a way to keep himself, and by extension, her, at the top. But Daniel had underestimated Evelyn, and Sophie had overestimated Daniel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her phone vibrated on the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen, already knowing who it would be. Olivia, one of the few people from her past who had never quite disappeared, despite Sophie's best efforts to keep that part of her life buried. She hesitated before answering. "I was wondering how long it would take you to call," Olivia said, skipping over any pleasantries. Sophie exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "Let me guess. You heard. Everyone heard. Your name is all over the gossip sites. Whitmore's mistress left in the cold. Not exactly the fairy tale ending you were hoping for, huh?" Sophie closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temple. "Don't start." Olivia sighed on the other end. "Look, I'm not calling to rub it in. I figured you might need a reality check. What's your plan now?" Sophie let out a dry laugh. "You think I have a plan?" "You'd better," Olivia said, her tone sharper now. "Because whatever you thought you were going to get out of this, it's gone. And you're not exactly known for thriving on your own, Sophie." The words stung more than Sophie wanted to admit. She had spent years running from this exact moment, from the possibility of ending up right back where she had started. And now here she was. No security, no backup plan, no safety net. Just her, alone, with nothing but the weight of her own mistakes pressing down on her. "You could come back," Olivia said after a moment. "Start over. It wouldn't be easy, but at least you wouldn't be doing it alone." Sophie stared at the wall, her jaw tightening. The idea of going back, of admitting defeat, of letting the people who had known her before see just how spectacularly she had failed, it made her stomach twist. But what choice did she have? She could sit in this apartment, waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. Or she could accept the truth. She had lost. And now, all she could do was figure out how to rebuild. "I'll think about it," she muttered. Olivia sighed. Don't think too long, Sophie. The world moves on fast, and if you don't keep up, it'll leave you behind. Sophie ended the call without responding, tossing the phone onto the couch beside her. She didn't want to keep up. She wanted to rewind. She wanted to go back to the moment when she thought she had won. But there was no going back, only forward. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea where that would lead. Daniel Whitmore had never known what it felt like to be powerless. Even in the worst moments of his life, even when deals fell through or investors pulled out, he had always known that with the right strategy, the right words, the right amount of money, he could fix it. He had built his empire on that certainty, on the unwavering belief that no situation was beyond his ability to manipulate. And yet, as he sat in the dimly lit office of his now crumbling empire, staring at the endless pages of legal documents and account closures, he was forced to confront a truth he had never allowed himself to believe. He had lost. The whiskey glass in his hand was nearly empty, the amber liquid swirling at the bottom as he turned it absently, his mind racing. The past few weeks had been a blur of phone calls, emergency meetings, and desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. But there was nothing left to save. Evelyn had planned every step of this destruction with ruthless precision, dismantling everything he had spent his life building before he even realized what was happening. His empire was in shambles. His investors were in full retreat. His name, once synonymous with power, had become a cautionary tale in the business world. And worst of all, she had taken his company. Not just the money, not just a settlement or a piece of the fortune they had built together, but actual control. She had executed a corporate takeover, securing a controlling stake in Whitmore Holdings, using his own arrogance against him. And now, he was left with nothing. The realization made his grip on the glass tighten until he thought it might crack beneath his fingers. He had underestimated her. He had believed, foolishly, that she would simply take her money and disappear, that she would leave him wounded but still standing. Instead, she had burned everything to the ground, leaving him with nothing but ashes. And the worst part? She had done it with a smile. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. His office, once the center of his empire, now felt like a tomb. Papers were strewn across his desk, emails from lawyers, final notices, letters from partners cutting ties. The walls, adorned with framed deals and accolades, felt like mocking reminders of a past that no longer existed. He had spent years crafting the image of an untouchable businessman, a king in his own right. And now, that image had been shattered. His phone vibrated against the desk, the screen lighting up with another call from his legal team. He let it ring. He already knew what they would say. Another loss, another ruling in Evelyn's favor, another reminder that he was no longer in control. He ran a hand through his hair, gripping the back of his neck as he tried to force his thoughts into some kind of order. He couldn't afford to spiral. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to claw his way back. Because there had to be a way back. There was always a way back. His mind worked furiously, combing through every possibility, every angle he hadn't explored. Evelyn had closed nearly every door, but there was one thing she hadn't taken from him: his knowledge. He knew the inner workings of the company better than anyone. He knew the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, the secrets hidden beneath the polished surface of the empire they had built. And if he couldn't win through legal means, if he couldn't reclaim what was his through traditional channels, then he would have to take a different approach. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. He hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Well, the man on the other end said, amusement clear in his tone. I was wondering how long it would take before you swallowed your pride. Daniel exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. I need a way back in. There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. Back in? Daniel, you're not just out. You've been erased. Your investors don't trust you. Your board is about to force you out permanently. The media is painting you as the fool who lost everything to his wife. You're a liability. Daniel clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. I don't need a reminder of how bad it is. I need a solution. You need leverage, the man said smoothly. And right now, the only leverage you have is the fact that you know how this game is played. Evelyn won because she studied you, Daniel. She knew exactly where to strike. But here's the thing. There's always something people overlook. No matter how well they plan, no matter how perfectly they execute, there's always one detail they miss. Daniel's mind raced. Evelyn had accounted for nearly everything, had ensured that all legal challenges were airtight, that his financial resources were depleted, that his reputation was damaged beyond immediate repair. But she had done all of this under the assumption that he would play by the rules, that he would fight back the way any rational businessman would. She had underestimated just how desperate he was. And desperation had a way of making a man dangerous. "What are you suggesting?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "I'm saying," the man replied, "that it's time to stop thinking like a businessman and start thinking like a survivor. You built Whitmore Holdings from the ground up. You know where the cracks are, where the vulnerabilities lie. And if Evelyn thinks she can erase you, then it's time you remind her that you don't go down that easily." Daniel leaned forward, his pulse steadying for the first time in days. "I need options." "There's always a way," the voice on the other end assured him. "And I happen to know a few people who specialize in unconventional solutions." A slow, calculating smile spread across Daniel's lips. He had spent his entire life building an empire, ensuring that no one could ever take what was his. And if Evelyn thought she had seen the last of him, if she thought she had stripped him of all his power, she was about to learn a very important lesson. He wasn't done yet. The call ended, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, a new sense of clarity settling over him. Evelyn had taken everything from him, had left him with nothing but his own rage and determination. But that was her mistake. Because as long as he had breath in his lungs, as long as he still had even a fraction of control, he would find a way to rise again. And this time, he wouldn't just be fighting for his company. He would be fighting to take her down. Evelyn Carter might have won the battle, but Daniel Whitmore was about to start a war. Evelyn Carter had spent months preparing for the storm that followed her departure, but she hadn't expected the eerie silence that came after it. The chaos, the backlash, the headlines, the desperate attempts from Daniel to claw his way back. It had all unfolded exactly as she predicted. The calls from his lawyers, the media's obsessive speculation about the fallout, the dramatic interviews with so-called insiders who claimed to know the real story. It was all noise, white-hot for a few weeks, and then, like all things, it faded. What she hadn't anticipated was the emptiness that came after. She sat in the quiet of her new office, the city stretching out beneath her in a sea of glittering lights, her reflection in the glass merging with the skyline. The world kept moving. Deals were still being made. People were still chasing wealth and power. And yet, for the first time in years, she found herself at a standstill. She had won. She had taken back everything, secured her independence, built a foundation that no one, not Daniel, not any man, could ever take from her again. So why did it feel like something was missing? Her assistant entered the room, placing a sleek folder on the desk. This just came in. The final agreement from his lawyers. Evelyn exhaled, her fingers grazing the edges of the folder. "Did he sign?" "Yes," the assistant said, her voice careful. "And he included a personal note." Evelyn's brow lifted slightly. That was unexpected. Daniel had fought tooth and nail against the divorce terms, dragging it through every legal loophole he could find. But in the end, he must have realized there was nothing left to salvage. She flipped the folder open, skimming the final signatures before pulling out a separate sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably his, sharp and deliberate. "You win. For now." She let out a slow breath, fingers tightening around the paper. Of course, even in defeat, Daniel couldn't help himself. It wasn't an apology, wasn't even an acknowledgement of what had led them here. It was a warning, a promise that he wasn't done, that he would find a way back. And maybe he would. Maybe one day he would rebuild himself into the man he used to be, or maybe he would crumble beneath the weight of his own arrogance. It didn't matter. That wasn't her problem anymore. Her assistant hesitated at the door. "Do you want me to respond?" Evelyn glanced at the note once more, then shook her head. "No." He said everything he needed to. The assistant nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. Evelyn sat there for a long moment, staring at the papers in front of her. It was over. Legally, financially, emotionally, every thread that had tied her to Daniel Whitmore had been severed. She had untangled herself from the life they built, walked away with more than she had ever expected. And yet, as she traced the edge of the paper with her fingertip, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not regret, not sadness, just finality. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. This time, it wasn't her assistant. She turned to find a familiar face, her lawyer, a man who had seen her through every step of this war, who had watched as she dismantled her old life and built a new one in its place. "You should be celebrating," he said, stepping inside and placing a bottle of champagne on her desk. "This is the part where you raise a glass and toast to your freedom." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I think I've had enough battles for one lifetime." He studied her for a moment, then leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "So what now?" She exhaled, glancing out at the skyline once more. That was the question, wasn't it? She had spent so long focused on the fight, on the next move, the next play, the next battle. But now, for the first time in years, there was no next move. Just the quiet space she had carved out for herself, waiting to be filled. "I don't know," she admitted, surprising herself. "For the first time in a long time, I don't have a plan." Her lawyer smirked, lifting the champagne bottle slightly. "Then I'd say that's worth celebrating." She laughed, a real one this time, and took the bottle from him, popping the cork with ease. The sound echoed in the quiet office, a sharp contrast to the stillness that had settled in her chest. She poured 2 glasses, clinking one against his before taking a slow sip. The bubbles fizzed against her tongue, crisp and light. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was the moment she had been waiting for, not the victory itself, but the realization that she had survived it, that she had come out on the other side not just intact, but stronger. The phone on her desk buzzed with another notification. This time, it wasn't from a lawyer or an investor or a journalist looking for a quote. It was an invitation, an exclusive panel on financial independence, a keynote speaker slot. Her name listed alongside some of the most influential business minds of the decade. A slow smile spread across her lips. Maybe she didn't need a plan. Maybe, for the first time, she could just move forward and see where the world took her. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing 2 simple words. "I accept." And just like that, she was no longer looking back. Evelyn Carter had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had played out in her mind what it would feel like to reach the end of this war and stand on the other side, victorious. She had told herself that she would feel relief, satisfaction, an overwhelming sense of triumph. And in some ways, she did. But as she sat on the terrace of a private villa in the Maldives, the sound of the waves rolling in the distance, the soft glow of the setting sun casting golden hues over the water, she realized the feeling that had settled deep in her chest wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even victory. It was peace. For the first time in years, her mind wasn't consumed with strategy, with damage control, with the constant weight of maintaining appearances. There were no board meetings looming, no financial battles to fight, no late-night phone calls from lawyers. The war was over, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she didn't have to think about what came next. She leaned back in the cushioned chair, stretching her legs out in front of her, letting the warm breeze brush against her skin. The wine glass in her hand was half full, condensation beating along the sides, the crisp white liquid cool against her fingers. She wasn't drinking to numb anything, wasn't using alcohol as an escape from reality. She was simply enjoying the taste, the moment, the stillness. Her phone sat beside her, untouched for hours. It had been buzzing all day, messages from business associates, invitations to events, inquiries from media outlets wanting exclusive interviews about the woman who had taken down Daniel Whitmore. She had ignored them all. She hadn't come here to talk about the past. She had come here to let it go. A soft knock at the sliding glass door drew her attention. Her assistant, Claire, stepped onto the terrace, her expression careful, respectful, as always. Evelyn had insisted she take the trip as well. After all, Claire had been with her through every step of this battle, had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure every piece of the plan fell into place. "There's another request for an interview," Claire said, holding up a sleek tablet. "Forbes, this time. They're calling you the woman who rewrote the rules of power." Evelyn let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Of course they are. They want a statement," Claire continued, hesitating slightly. "Even just a few words about the divorce, the takeover, the fallout with Daniel." Evelyn sighed, setting her wine glass down before meeting Claire's gaze. "You know what to say?" Claire nodded, already anticipating the answer. "No comment." Evelyn smiled. "No comment." She had no interest in feeding the media frenzy. Let them speculate. Let them spin their stories. She had said everything she needed to say through her actions. There was nothing left to explain. Claire hesitated again, then cleared her throat. There's one more thing. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? It's Daniel, Claire said, watching her carefully. He gave an interview this morning. Evelyn exhaled, unsurprised. Of course, he had. She had been expecting this, had known that Daniel wouldn't simply fade into obscurity without at least attempting to control the narrative one last time. What did he say? Claire handed her the tablet. Evelyn took it, glancing down at the screen. The headline was bold, attention-grabbing, designed to stir controversy. Daniel Whitmore speaks out, the truth behind the divorce. She tapped the video, watching as Daniel's face filled the screen. He looked different. Not broken, not entirely defeated, but not the man he had once been. There was no arrogance in his posture, no smugness in his expression. Instead, there was something else, something quieter, something almost resigned. I won't lie, he was saying, his voice measured, controlled. Losing Evelyn the way I did, it shook me. She was always smarter than people gave her credit for. Smarter than I gave her credit for. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected honesty. She beat me. Daniel continued, exhaling slowly. Fair and square. And I won't pretend it didn't sting. But I'll say this, she earned it. Every bit of it. Evelyn stared at the screen, emotions flickering too quickly to catch. I made mistakes, Daniel admitted, shaking his head slightly. I underestimated her. I thought she would crumble. I thought she would need me. I was wrong. She inhaled deeply, pressing her lips together. She had spent so much time preparing for his retaliation, for whatever cruel narrative he would spin to paint himself as the victim. But this was unexpected. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was conceding. The video ended, and Evelyn set the tablet down, staring at the horizon as her thoughts settled. She had spent years entangled in the web of Daniel Whitmore's world, had fought tooth and nail to escape it. And now, finally, there was nothing left between them. No more battles. No more unfinished business. Just freedom. She turned to Claire, her voice calm, certain. Tell Forbes they can print this. Daniel and I have nothing left to say to each other. Claire smiled slightly, nodding before stepping away, leaving Evelyn alone once again. She reached for her phone, opening her email. The invitation to the financial conference was still there, waiting for her response. The opportunity was huge, a chance to cement her legacy, to carve out her place as a force in the business world separate from Daniel, separate from the past. But she didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she stood, stretching as she walked toward the edge of the terrace, letting the last rays of sunlight warm her skin. She had spent her entire life planning, strategizing, thinking 10 steps ahead. Maybe, for now, she didn't need to do any of that. Maybe, for once, she could just exist. The future would come. Opportunities would come. But for tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. Free. Finally.